Dear students, today in this lecture, I am going to discuss a very significant essay by Jacques Lacan, The Mirror Stage as Formative of the Function of the Eye as Revealed in Psychoanalytic Experience. Jacques Lacan was a French psychoanalyst and his primary concern was with psychoanalysis. However, his theoretical concepts have applications in many other domains of knowledge like culture studies, film studies, and literature. This iconic essay was presented by Lacan in the 16th International Congress of Psychoanalysis at Zurich in 1949. In this, Lacan explains to us his theory of subjectivity, which has tremendous implications for the reading and interpretation of literature. But before we take up this essay, it is important for us to understand the significance of this essay because without realizing its significance, it is just not possible to understand the meaning of this essay. We are basically students of literature, and as professionals engaged in the study of literature, it is important for us to analyze and interpret literature. And if we reflect on the idea of literature, we realize that it is very much connected to the idea of self. The literary text is created by a human self, the author. So basically the literary text has its origin in the human self. It is created by a human self, and that is why it is important for us to know the nature of the self and its various facets, its constituents. So, one, that the author who creates the text is a self, and that is why it is so important. Another idea is that the reader who derives meanings from the text is also a self. And the kind of meaning that is drawn from the text is always colored by and influenced by the reader himself. So, these are the two very important considerations when we interpret literature. And that is why these theories of self help us in understanding the literary text. This was with regard to the significance of this essay. There are various theories of self in philosophy. Through these theories, we try to understand who we are. There are theories in psychoanalysis also. In psychoanalysis, you must have heard the name of Sigmund Freud, who is often considered to be the originator of psychoanalysis. I'll just touch upon his idea of self because it helps us in putting in perspective the Lacanian idea of self. Freud was primarily concerned with self, how it functions in this world. As we all know, Freud gave the three divisions of the structure of the human self or the subject: the id, the ego, the superego. Basically, what he is trying to say is that as a human self or subject in the human world, we have many desires which our culture doesn't allow us to realize or fulfill, because the human society needs discipline, and naturally, discipline needs some kind of repression or restriction. So, Freud's idea of the self is that as human beings, we are repressed selves. And this was the background when Lacan was formulating his theory of the self. But the Lacanian idea of self is very different from that of Freud. Even though Freud was the first one who started psychoanalysis, and Lacan was a self-confessed Freudian, his concept of subject or the human self is radically different. The Lacanian self is a symbolic self, which means that the human self is created by the symbolic world. The symbolic is a huge concept in Lacan, which includes culture, ideologies, traditions, law, religion, history, all narratives and texts. In short, anything that makes sense to us can be bracketed within the symbolic system. In this context, it is also important for you to understand that the symbolic is the domain of language, and hence the Lacanian self is a linguistic construct created in and through language. But it is interesting to know that the human being is not born as a symbolic being. He is born as a biological being but becomes symbolic. The question is, how? Lacan explains the process of subjectivization in terms of the three spaces of the unconscious. The first one is the real. This is the pre-linguistic space beyond language and signification. It is the space where language has not yet intervened, and the child, as a purely biological being, is in complete harmony with its biological existence. And it is not aware of itself as a separate being, as an I. The second one is the imaginary, the intermediary stage, also called the mirror stage. It is from this stage onwards that the child begins to identify with the symbolic system. This is the stage of identity formation. The third one is the symbolic. As I have already explained to you, this whole physical material world is part of the symbolic. The above three spaces, according to Lacan, are inseparable. Lacan explains the interdependence of the three orders through the figure of the Borromean knot. If you observe closely, you will find that the three rings are connected to each other in such a way that if we sever any one of them, the whole structure will collapse. This was the background to the mirror stage. Now, we shall try to understand the significance of the mirror stage in the process of subjectivization. In the very beginning of the essay, Lacan explains the significance of the mirror stage in the formation of ego or human identity. As a psychoanalyst, this stage was so significant for him because it sheds light on the image relation that the human beings carry with them for the rest of their lives, even when they enter the symbolic. First, let me explain to you the timeline of the mirror stage. For a human child, the mirror stage begins around the age of 6 months and lasts till the age of approximately 18 months. This is important to understand because before this, as I told you earlier, the child is in the real stage, in complete harmony with its biological existence. It is not aware of its identity as I, as it identifies itself completely with the objects and images around it. Then, at this time, the child starts recognizing the images. It sees its own image in the mirror, and the lure of the image affects him for the rest of his life. At this point, it is also important for us to understand how the image relation of the human child is different from the image relation of the other animals like the chimpanzees. As we know, some animals like monkeys or the chimpanzees are able to recognize their image in the mirror. But as soon as they understand that it is just an image, they realize that it is empty, vacuous, they master its image nature and they give it up. They do not carry it forward. But in case of the human child, this image gives a kind of pleasure, an attraction that is lifelong. When the child recognizes his image in the mirror, the jubilation, it is me, is just symptomatic of how the child is going to relate to his image in future. This image recognition or image identification in the case of human child gets into a kind of imago identification. I shall just explain to you the concept of imago so that you understand that the destination of the image recognition is imago identification. Imago is an ideal or acceptable image as it is received by the cultural and the social system. It is organic, relevant, it makes sense to the symbolic system as it creates an illusion of wholeness. So, the image is not significant in itself, as ultimately the destination of image identification is imago identification. In this context, I would like to quote from Lacan himself. Quote, "We have only to understand the mirror stage as an identification, the transformation that takes place in the subject when he assumes an image, whose predestination to this phase effect is sufficiently indicated by the use in analytic theory of the ancient term imago." Unquote. Let me explain this further. When the child enters into the symbolic system, he carries this capacity to identify with the image. The image, as we know, is not real. It is just an image with a number of meanings attached to it. The child identifies with the image. This ideal I or ego is what one wants to be. Once the imago identification happens, we are never out of it. In fact, as I shall explain to you later, this is the struggle of the human beings, to live with their ideal image and the reality of their lives. As Lacan tells us in this essay, that even when the child is unable to master his motor skills, even when his body is incapable of taking any organic action, what Lacan calls a certain dehiscence, a specific prematurity of birth in man, even then, at this stage, he is able to marvel at his image. So, this insufficiency on the one hand and the ideal image on the other become kind of two poles on which the struggle continues. Lacan brings in another concept, the concept of the Gestalt, to explain to us the effect of image on the formation of identity or the ego. Gestalt is the organized whole of an organism that has identifying effects on the individual. It is from the Gestalt of a species, like human species, and the instinctual relationship that the individual forms with the Gestalt, that effect can be seen in all the species. Lacan refers to other species like the locusts or the birds, in whom the sexual response or their reproductive function is affected by the Gestalt of that species. In a human being, in the mirror stage, the image that the child perceives is the whole organic image. That organic image in relation to the imago of the other human being, that relation gives an idea, a kind of instinct that I need to be like this, or my future identity must have this kind of image that I see in the mirror or the imago of the other. So, even when the child is actually suffering from the insufficiency of his real life, or he is dependent on other people for his life, even at this time, his attraction for the image, his identification with the Gestalt of his species, with his own organic image, gives him a kind of instinctual relation with this human world. And it is that future life that the self aspires to be. Now we understand that our identity is alienated from its own reality. It is this relationship with the external world that verifies our identity. So, the human being, in his essence, lives with a gap. This understanding of the self that, on the one hand, we are disintegrated, we live with a void, we live with a gap, that is the reality. On the other hand, the symbolic system or the imaginary world, the intrusion of images in our mental state as well as our psychological state, makes us believe that the world is coherent, organized, and fine. Now, the interaction between these two kinds of forces, on the one hand, disruptive forces, the problematic issues of life we are faced with, and on the other hand, the world that makes us believe that there is a possibility of having an organic self. The excess of any of these can result in psychological condition. Like a person who believes that everything is fine may not relate to the problems of life, and he might create a world that is too fantastic, difficult to believe in. Somebody who is living with the idea of complete, whole, organic, and a fortress kind of condition where nothing can go wrong, and suddenly the real conditions of life erupt in such a way that the whole idea of a complete life is punctured. It might come crashing down. That person may be psychologically affected to such an extent that it might be difficult for him to survive the mental condition, because the illusion that we are living in might suddenly evaporate, might vanish, and this can create psychological condition. On the other hand, a person might be obsessed with the gaps in life, with his incompetence. That also might lead to a psychological condition. So, Lacan is relating the imaginary stage, the mirror stage, with the psychological issues of life. This understanding on part of the psychoanalyst can give him tools, can provide him a deeper understanding of the self of human beings. Why this has happened? This question. Once this is resolved, there is a possibility of treatment, of finding a cure, of reconnecting with the symbolic and the imaginary, because both are necessary. One cannot wish away the realities of life, and at the same time, it is also necessary to understand that what we understand as complete, whole, organic, that is also problematic. How a person can face the problems of life, it can make us aware of that. Lacan concludes this essay by referring to a very famous Indian phrase, that is Tat Tvamasi, which is translated in English as Thou art that. But we should not be confused with the religious and mystical overtones that the Indian philosophical dictum carries. Here, Lacan has used this phrase in a very different sense. What he attempts to do is, he wants to use this mirror stage to cure the psychological sickness that the patients might be suffering from. He observes that if we can make the patients aware of the systemic process that has made them who they are, they might be able to understand the constituents of the self in a better way. The constituents of the self, as Lacan perceives them, are various identifications, or, to use a better word, various illusionary identifications that happen when a human being passes through the mirror stage. In the process of growing up, the child identifies completely with the gestalt, the coherent, stable self that the society presents him with. This image identification is never given up. There are so many issues that a human being faces in life because, on the one hand, the reality of human life is that it is full of incompetencies, gaps, and on the other hand, there is a belief, a kind of illusionary identification with the stable organic self. Lacan uses this idea of the mirror stage. If the patient can be made aware that everything you believe in has to be rational, stable, complete, organic, all this is an illusion. There's a reality that lies beyond that. The reality is that there are gaps between what we are and what we want to be, or what we believe us to be, what our expectations are. If that understanding is developed, there is the possibility of a cure. Probably, the psychological issues they encounter will become less problematic, less troublesome, and the psychological effect that the symbolic world creates in the human being may be mitigated. Also, by understanding this theory, there are many things that can happen to the human world. If we understand who we are, and if we realize the symbolic and the imaginary nature of this world, the sociological differences, the divisions that we live with, probably there is a possibility of reducing that also. Now, the question arises that how the understanding of the mirror stage in the formation of the self is relevant or useful in the study of literature. This understanding can be applied to the 4 significant factors in literary studies: the nature of the literary text, the writer, the critic, and the literary characters. The kind of the text that is written is surely reflective of the traces of the imaginary that remain in the unconscious of the writer. So, the preoccupations, the obsessions, the desires, the fantasies that the writer has, those get transferred in one or the other form onto the literary text. When we try to reconstruct the writer's identity or his image, the meanings from the text can help us in doing that. Also, many of the critical practices in the present times are focusing on the ideological motivations in the making of a text. If we interrogate the history of literary criticism, we find that literary criticism too is affected by subjective ideologies and opinions. For example, if the author is a male, his perception of the world is very different from that of a female. So we do realize that the imaginary of the male writer seeps into the texture of the literary text. Many feminist critics have exposed the patriarchal overtones in the literary criticism of the male critics. For example, Elaine Showalter, in her essay Towards Feminist Poetics, has observed how many male critics have been unable to understand the plight of the female characters because they themselves are created by the patriarchal ideologies and perspectives in their symbolic system. Showalter specifically mentions Irving Howe's critique of Thomas Hardy's celebrated novel, The Mayor of Casterbridge, to explain how his unconscious beliefs and ideologies have affected his literary interpretation. Thus, it is evident that the imaginary of the self affects all the discourses and narratives, including those of the writers and the critics. Hence, this essay gives us better insights into the making of the writer, the reader, the critic, and the characters in the literary narratives. Thank you.